much. Thank you so much for the clarity. My papers for professorial promotion has been even not sent out now. They are waiting for getting them in 2 or 3 days' time. So it will take at minimum 1 full year if when some process of making me professor will take place, if at all. So I am simply a humble doctor. Shalom lekulam. My cordial greetings to Madame Geraldine Auerbach, to dearest Alex Knapp, to members of Ernest Bloch family, to dear longtime friends and colleagues, to Bloch lovers. Professor Jesse Rosenberg, I am deeply grateful to you for your extraordinary assistance, care, and psychological and professional support in preparing this meeting. Thank you so much. I want to say right away that I am far from the businesslike and pragmatic approach to music accepted among many musicians and musical activists. I will a bit explain what I mean. I mean, measuring Bloch's music as performant frequencies, rank of artists who play him, special compositional techniques that are placed on the scale of historical progressive line of development, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I do not deny the importance of this approach, pragmatic and professional, especially when it comes to the practical issues of organizing musical performances or professional aspects of musical theory, technology, and marketing. For my part, I prefer to comment on music in parallel with its emotional impact on our system of moral and cultural concepts. I would like to place the focus of our meeting on listening to 5 short movements by Ernest Bloch and to discuss what was heard from 3 points of view. We are talking about the Visions of and Prophecies cycle, which is a piano version of the orchestral interludes of a large-scale work for solo cello and orchestra called Voice in the Wilderness. Both of these works were written in 1935, 1936. Both of these works, both symphonic and piano, are inspired by the text of the second part of the book of prophet Isaiah, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. The symphonic version of this work is a direct spiritual continuation of the concept of Shlomo, Hebraic rhapsody for cello and grand orchestra. Both here and there, the solo part of the cello personifies a gifted man of highest inspiration. In the Rhapsody, we are talking about the wise king and philosopher Solomon, whereas in the second case, the cello personifies the outstanding prophet. 3 perspectives from which I would like to comment on this piano cycle are its spirit of the Jewish prophets, its acoustic character evoking the feeling of the Negev desert, and its cultural and political significance in the light of Richard Wagner's postulations about the inability of the Jews to recognize high inspiration and create their own high vision of the world, and thus being condemned by those so-called inspired to a life in curse and final death, without regard to their attempts to hide under the guise of the change of religion, conversion. I retell here briefly the contents of Wagner's famous article, The Jury in Music. Concert music does not illustrate what is happening with a person in a literal way and around him. Although it is perfectly able to illustrate the chirping of birds, the waves and storms of the sea and ocean, the rustle of leaves and rain, and much more. Good music conveys the meaning of the human experience and a better understanding of it. Therefore, now, when I show you illustrations of the desert and the so-called burning and non-burning bush, this is not intended to illuminate the contents of the music, but only to direct the listener's attention to the area of the topic voiced by it. Here are my illustrations. The Tzin desert of central Negev, we filmed with my wife early in September. And the Snebo air effect I took from open internet. And the Snebo air effect I took from the open internet because there is no way to approach that place by car, and I was not able to go for 25 kilometers in desert by foot. Here are the first three parts of the cycle. Beforehand, we shall listen to 1 minute of the orchestral version of the work. Hello.
Yes,
Now, with
please.
your permission, I would like to comment on that part of what we listened to, that what is lending itself to verbal commentary. First of all, I would like to refer to the general atmosphere of the statements of the prophet Isaiah. Here are they. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord, from Lord's hand, double for all her sins. A voice of one calling, in the desert prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and to all mankind together will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? All men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. The entire atmosphere of these statements is permeated with boundless sadness about the weakness and insignificance of people. Even the beauty of their existence is similar to the seasonal existence of flowers. In a moment they die out and only lamentation remains. This position is typical for most pages of the Hebrew Bible. Human existence is seen as the existence of intellectually and spiritually limited people, paralyzed by their stupid impulses, who are, with rare exceptions, unable to lead a beautifully dignified existence. Actually, the opposition of human weaknesses to the ideals of the worthy, called divine existence, is, in my opinion, the main spiritual charge of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible does not let up in showing the inner tension of hot-headed people who in rare moments experience the vision of the straight and beautiful path. Hence the mental anguish that constantly afflicts people due to their devotion to their petulant urges and to the spirit of the crowd that pushes them to tribalism and to the stupid and cruel ecstasy. Ernest Bloch is aware of this tragic tension, since early in his youth he noticed the huge gap between the declared monotheistic ideals of his environments and the actual behavior of human beings. He wrote about this in his well-known letter to his parents following his sister's conversion to Christianity when she married her husband. That Bloch's feeling of the gap between the declared and human reality took on an almost professional philosophical dimension during about 8 years of his contacts with the theologian and translator Robert Godet. Later, it turns out that Godet studied Bloch as a typical Jewish figure against the background of his own translation of the writings of Houston Stewart Chamberlain's book about the parasitic foreignness of the Jews in the Western world and the rot they spread in the Western society. After Bloch learned what Godet's true position was toward him, he, of course, cut contact with him. But he did not erase from his consciousness his ability to think in qualitative philosophical manner. Bloch recognized the pain of the beautiful divine example of life that stands before men in all clarity without men being able to approach it. This tragedy shaped Bloch's musical tone in most of his musical works, and even more so in his biblical works. For the purposes of musical expression, Bloch developed a unique harmonic language. It was based on seventh and ninth chords that contain either a tritone or an augmented triad, constantly waiting for a traditional tonal solution in which chords without the harmonic third come in place of the traditional major or minor ones. Instead, octaves appear that are filled with fourths and fifths. This is how the effect of desert sound is created, full of volume and space, but without the immediate tonal appeal that characterizes the urban spirit. In the composition that I present here to you, there are three main ideas: the desert and the people scattered in it, symbolizing the undefined and helpless existence of the people; the moving prophet preacher and the phenomenon of the divine tidings of flashes of light, thunder, and stunning supernatural power. The common man living in the desert is thrilled by the vision and for brief moments is filled with the spirit of truth about how to live. In fact, these three central ideas produce a vision of human existence that contains an imperative to correct its existence. Hence, the high reliability of both the biblical messages and of Bloch music. The prophet is depicted as slowly wandering and stopping to absorb the divine messages. He also sees huge supernatural flashes perceived as orders from the Almighty, hence the change of slow and faster march-like episodes. Let us listen now to the slow steps of prophet in the wilderness, overtaken by heavenly inspiration, the fourth episode of the cycle, please.
Yes, if you'd like to continue, Zacharia.
Music is able to appeal to human ideas about its sublime, great and universal. In other words, about the divine. If a composer is monotheistic in his outlook and thinks well through his musical ideas, he has a chance to awaken the listener's perception of the sublime as well. At the same time, the feeling of the sublime is also familiar to many completely non-religious people. It's just about the perception of the universe as a single coherent whole, where the same laws operate, which are given to man and mankind to gradually better and better understand it. Great composers manage to find their own areas of understanding of the world and their own ways of advancing to the sublime. That's why there are many different geniuses among composers. Not so many, but still. Hearing the revelations of the knowledge of life, even non-religious listeners are imbued with belief in the music that carries these revelations. On the other hand, people are susceptible to pseudo-sublime. As a rule, we are talking about ideological attitudes that unite a part of people as a group that rises above other people. This pseudo-sublime often has an even greater attraction power than the power of the absolutely sublime. The pseudo-sublime inflates the pride of belonging to a group and often turns off a person's own moral responsibility. This gives an incredible festive lightness to a person and a feeling of literally messianic liberation. In such a state, people of the in-group seem to have supernatural power that can conquer and enslave the rest of the world with ecstatic joy. The problem with such a state is that it cannot last more than a few years, during which the world of the outgroups unites against them and destroys them and destroys their collective power. So the charm of the pseudo-sublime is in its temporality, in its deaf anticipation of a distant existential danger, in the excitement of turning a lie into a temporary truth. Indeed, music is able to express this sense of temporary ecstasy. At the same time, an outside listener can detect emotional falsehood and be horrified. This emotional falsehood is not a miserable lie. On the contrary, it is a passionate conviction that one is right. Such conviction is so great that it is expressed in absolute moral indisputability. In the famous monologue of Hans Sachs, überall wann, from the Meistersinger aus Nürnberg by Wagner, moral indisputability is expressed by musical means, an epic narrative, unhurried tone, a very low register of the musical line of cellos and double basses accompanying the Shoemaker's poet's monologue, as if he is a true and indisputable king. Episodic, frivolous overflows reflecting unassuming thoughts of the common people. And of course, the final words of the monologue, let madness serve good deeds. We just can pass through this sentence lightheartedly, but it is what actually Putin thinks and does in Ukraine, in his own view. It's a direct path to genocidal crime. By the way, Hans Sachs refers to himself here in the third person, as the leaders of simple common people do. Here are two excerpts from the well-known Hans Sachs monologue from the third act of Wagner's Meistersinger of Nürnberg.
Blick in Stadt und Weltchronik den Grund mir aufzufinden, warum gar bis aufs Blut die Leute sich quälen und schinden in unglückselger Wut. Hans Sachs es macht, dass den Pfarrer denken kann, ein edlen Werk zu tun. Denn lässt uns nicht ruhen, selbst hier in Nürnberg, so sei's solche Werk, die sollten vor Gemeinden dienen und nie
Okay, I am back. The striking effect of this monologue is that the confident ideology of Hans Sachs as popular leader is presented to people as a truth in the highest instance. A dramatic monologue, occasionally based on dramatic minor chords, creates an illusion of a higher truth. Throughout the monologue, there is not a single hint of personal doubt or recognition of one's own weaknesses or vulnerabilities. The listener, a person living the life of an ordinary and often offended layman, will inevitably be imbued with devotion to the Hans Sachs presented here. At last, he is freed from doubts. He is led by an infallible leader. By the way, it would seem that the beginning of the Florestan's monologue from Fidelio, the great Beethoven's opera, is almost identical. The striking effect of this monologue is, unlike Wagner, Beethoven presents the freedom fighter Florestan as a suffering man. The orchestra now and then takes off far up beyond the limits of the male tenor. Minor is much more dominant. And turning to God as a savior shows the fundamental modesty of the hero. Empathy arises in the listener, the sympathy of equals, and the desire to help, and not the desire to surrender one's personality. Let us go back to Bloch and his prophet Isaiah. The prophet here undoubtedly sympathizes with the bitter fate of his unfortunate people, tens of thousands of whom were taken captive to distant Babylon, and the hapless others were left under the primitive occupation regime. The prophet hears the voice of God, but does not identify with it. He rather experiences the inaccessibility of this voice to the ears and hearts of his fellow tribesmen. Here is the last part of the suite. The voice of God, having said his own, leaves the desert and the people scattered there. The world remains celestial and tragically ineffective in its own affairs. This truth is much less optimistic. It does not lead to ecstasy. However, this is a worthy conversation of equal and respected people. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Zacheria Plavin, for that really very stimulating, thought-provoking presentation. Thank you also for your magnificent playing in those recorded examples. Very much appreciated those. I am sure there are comments and questions from those gathered here. Maybe I can start with a question myself. This contrast that you draw between the genuine sublimity that we find in the music of Bach and the pseudo sublimity in Hans Sachs's monologue at the beginning of Act 3 of Die Meistersinger. When you made the parallel between that monologue and the opening of Florestan's scene at the beginning of Act Two of Fidelio, were you trying to say that Beethoven's Fidelio also is only pseudo sublime?
By no means,
Okay,
no.
okay, because maybe I just need to have that explained, what the parallel is between the Fidelio excerpt and this sublimity, these two different kinds of sublimity, pseudo
Well,
and real.
technically speaking, on the surface, it is almost the same idea. Ti-da, pa-pam, ta-ti-ram. It's the same even orchestration, the same tempo, everything is the same um, en masse. But the outcome is totally different. One is compassionate and full of equality and respect to human soul. And another is actually dumping people into blind following of the leader.
I see. All right. So there are certain musical similarities, but taken in very different ways by these two different.
And the difference is played out with rather minuscule, not very salient details, so that you cannot even put your finger on, well, without recurring to good research to see what's actually the difference. But one is eternal sublimity, and another is a fake.
A kind of temporary ecstasy that
Yes,
doesn't really reach the same level of meaning.
yes, of temporary meaning. But people who are not in the not in the mood of already being surrendered to it, they feel the problem. Clara Schumann was very much aware of it. She was she expressed herself very sharply against Mr. Wagner,
Yes.
and because of this, she felt this manipulation of grandness of music.
Yes. Reported that she felt ill after a performance of Tristan und Isolde. It actually affected her almost physically.
Well, she knew she was a great lady with great soul and great intellect, and actually, well, she was a great composer, by the way.
And sorry, she was who? Who are you talking about?
Schumann, Clara Schumann, wife of Robert Schumann. Yes, thank you. Malcolm, please.
Well, thank you very much. I thought that was just splendid, and I would like to second the fact how beautiful the piano playing was in that. Was just glorious to listen to. Thank you very much. And I could see the influence of Louis Kentner in the playing, which was wonderful. I found really interesting your kind of biblical text, your reading of the biblical text, and then looking at the parallels in the music. And how much do you think Bloch himself did that, and how much is that a post hoc analysis that you're doing?
Well, I would not go into a posteriori judgment. Wouldn't I be aware of historical facts that Bloch read quite substantial biblical excerpts, first under the guidance of Robert Godet, and then almost simultaneously under the guidance of Edmund Flegg. Both of them, I am not sure that they have been acquainted between themselves, Godet and Flegg. Definitely, I would not think that Flegg would like Robert Godet. So, but both of them actually were involved in researching or contemplating biblical or central biblical texts, actually, or prophetic or from the Pentateuch. And both of them actually stood around Bloch in very massive presence. So they, from each person stood, this one from the right hand and this from the left hand, and all they talk was for a couple of years at least about biblical contents. And Bloch, because he was a absolutely untiring letter writer, so he eternalized actually in his writings, in his letters, his feelings about reading those excerpts of Bible, um, and his own comments, which has been preserved, and you can find it basically in the Library of Congress in Washington. So you see, he wrote, and I saw it also, and I actually it is the biblical presence in Bloch's music is omnipresent. It is always starting from that year in 1911 or 12 or whatever, when he had this problem, this Macbeth's semi-success, semi-not success in Paris, and actually felt that he reached a cul-de-sac, and then he started to contemplate what should he do further. And then his father died, and whatever, it was a complicated thing. But actually, from all of this, he found this way of doing Bible and music, doing Hebrew Bible in music. Then, of course, he added all kinds of interviews, which he gave here and there, which are, in my opinion, less interesting than his profound ear for existential feeling of being Jewish, not being Jew, but being Jewish. I mean, he never deteriorated into observant orthodoxy or to keeping this kind of rights as being as example of being Jew. He was philosophically minded, and he just discussed things with himself and, of course, with everybody who would listen to him around Moses and his vision of monotheism, and of course prophetic ethics, which interested him very much. So it is very much inside the music, and he writes about it. It is not invented thing.
I noticed that it was not until your remarks just now that I finally heard words like Jew or Jewish, because those words are absent from the presentation that you shared with us. And when you and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, Zacharia, and I mentioned the word Jewish, you were very quick to react to it. I think perhaps preferring to avoid using that word because of its connotations with the modern people known as Jews, whereas what you were focusing on was something much deeper, much more ancient, much more universal, this profound prophetic tradition of Isaiah, which goes so much deeper than Jews or Judaism.
Would you like me to comment your words?
Yes, I would like you to comment on my words.
Look, I think that not everyone, by fate of his life or and circumstances of his existence, is compelled to think about basic ethical and geopolitical aspects of his belonging to some kind of group, whatever the group is, Latvians, Chechens, whatever, Muslims or whatever, defined by faith or defined by ethnicity or defined by amount of money in the bank somewhere in Switzerland. So not everyone thinks things deeply about, because he is preoccupied with current state of his life. He has matters to do and perform and to survive and to support his offspring and so on. So it is a practical existence, and usually the common sense revolves around this practical thinking. Jews, that I mean those who were expelled or fled what is now called Palestine or Israel or whatever, which is Eastern Mediterranean coast, then and found themselves in Rome or in Alsace or whatever, no, never mind where, they were devoid of any physical power, because they were actually allowed to dwell in every place on the provided they are not carrying weapons. So they have been totally dependent on kings and their entourage. And this developed, of course, some kind of psychology of self-insignificance. Which is, well, let us lobby things, let us ask very well, let us try, let us, and the last resource or recourse is, of course, to flee to another place where it is somewhat better. So, and it actually is for a Jewish existence, it is a quite a normal state of mentality and of the life itself. Many in Israel by also feel that it is a temporary thing, and they actually go on thinking in this pre-statehood mood. And because of this, by the way, they frequently vote for irresponsible leaders. I cannot stand it, by the way, but it is all out of light-hearted disregard of responsibility for force and how to use it, and what is the limit of this force and how to use it so that tragedies would never occur again. So I suppose that the idea of what you said, ancient and profound, it is simply a statehood technique of thinking, and this requires a large amount of social mutuality, so that people would not leave one at the expense of the another one, and mutual assistance, and of course creditability and some kind of cohesion. And this is what actually is discussed in prophetic things, and by the way, in the Mosaic commandments by themselves. So when we say that it is some kind of ancient or not ancient, I suppose it is not just ancient. It is it is a common sense, but it is common sense not in a superficial or running and passing way, but something which is, if we wish to invest into more solid existence, so that we could plan for our children and for ourselves, for our for our old days and whatever. So that it would be part of our general outlook, what we are doing as society. And in my opinion, this is what Bloch felt very much. And he felt the difference between this and between his tribesmen or co-religionists or whatever in Geneva, or in every place where he actually saw that people are preoccupied with their own business. And there is no common geopolitical preoccupation of how to survive together. And he found this at least partially in the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible was actually whatever the criticisms and whatever, but it is still was, well, let us remember that the Hebrew Bible actually was a product of statehood thought around the days of King Josiah or Yeshayahu. And when we know it, and we know it from the Bible itself, as a way, Sefer Dvarim, yes? So how do you call it? Deuteronomy. So when we see it, we understand that actually the whole thing of classical biblical thinking of monotheism is actually based on some kind of necessity of statehood existence. Because of this, Solomon is so celebrated. Because of this, David, who is an absolutely negative person, by the way, double traitor, and whatever, womanizer, and I do not know what, and actually a killer. And even this, he is somehow celebrated because he was in those days he was recognized as mythologically, because he didn't exist perhaps as a historical figure, but mythologically he was recognized as a reasonably good statement. So when you see it, actually, you feel that this ancient text actually it is a political text or geopolitical text. And when we recognize it, and when we recognize that Bloch recognized it, then we see the bifurcation between Eufen Pripeček, Brenta Feiru, Unin Stubis Hayes. At home, we have a good thing. It's warm at home, but outside it is not our business. Unin Stubis Hayes. No, but you cannot do it here in Israel, or geopolitically speaking, when you are even sitting in the United States or United Kingdom or whatever, we are all became actually connected into much more unified entity of common geopolitical society or whatever congregation. So it at least partly became a back Bloch's world, and not the small congregational anxious world of Eufen Pripeček.
I see. Thank you very much for that exhaustive reply.
Okay.
Time, Alex, you have a comment or questions, please.
Yeah, well, thank you, Zacharia. Very profound, thought-provoking, as I have known you to be over many decades, actually, and I've always appreciated very much how you approach Bloch, and from a different perspective from usual. Actually, I feel that you see, the spiritual perspectives from a Jewish dimension, but nevertheless much more universal as well. I've got 2 points that I would like to ask. One is really more perhaps philosophical, and the other one is more musical. The philosophical one is this: you mentioned Isaiah and you quoted from Isaiah, comfort ye, my people, and continuing with that quotation, which of course forms an extremely significant part of Handel's Messiah. And this brings us to the whole question then of the role of not Christianity, but the role of Jesus in Bloch's thinking. Because Jesus, apparently, according to Bloch, was the only true Christian who ever lived. And he was very much taken with this, and this caused quite a lot of misunderstanding among people, because Bloch wrote, exactly as he felt, and he didn't necessarily think about how it might be interpreted by the people who read or heard him speak. And of course, this led to some difficulties now and again, but Bloch said it the way he felt it. And I'm interested because also when you mentioned his sister converting to Judaism when she married her husband was also Jewish.
Yes.
And they converted together
Yes.
to Christianity because they promised that they would do this, as you know, if they were able to conceive a child. And they did conceive a child, and they promised the pastor that if that were the case, they would both convert together to Christianity. And of course, this created quite an upheaval in the Bloch family, as you might imagine, with Bloch's parents, et cetera, et cetera. I would like them. So my first question really is, do you feel that there is something somewhere in a spiritual, no, I would say perhaps a religious approach to visions and prophecies, or indeed voice in the
Voices in the wilderness.
Voice in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that there's something that, and also you mentioned the desert. Do you feel that maybe there are some elements that could be attributed to shall we say, an unorthodox view of the role of Jesus or Christianity in Bloch's thinking?
For the sake of precision, could you please repeat your very last sentence?
Well, as far as I remember it, it was, do you feel that there, was there any significance in Bloch's feeling about Jesus in the way in which he composed visions and prophecies as being something that goes historically back 2,000 years?
Okay, it is, our time is actually limited, and this is a very large-scale question, which we should do as briefly as possible. And in order to do it, we have to divide it into 3 or 4 micro questions. First of all, the whole thing of Isaiah's prophecy of his second book, second part of the book, which is used by the Christians traditionally as prediction of the coming of Jesus, as he predicted. Secondly, and because of this, actually, the whole thing is actually that Christ was some kind of overturning point of Judaism and freeing it from its inadequacies. And because of this, it was a true revelation, which should be followed with all hearts and whatever. And the earlier vision version should be abandoned. It is a classical Christian attitude when we are speaking about Isaiah in his second part of the book. The second is Bloch, when he spoke about Jesus or Jesus Christ as the only Christian, and he was 21 or 19 years old when he wrote about it. Yes, so it was quite early in his life, and he was still not very much educated, and it was still in the years before he met Godet. and these actual semi-professional philosophical education took place there under Godet, actually. And so it was a bit amateur expression, in my opinion. And we have to understand that the professional classical Christianity began not with Jesus Christ and not with Saint Paul and Saint Peter, but 300 years later, with the great fathers of Christianity, Saint Augustine, Saint Ambrosius, and Abelard, and Hieronymus, those great thinkers who actually rethought what was accumulated between new legends about the life of Christ, and then they actually organized this new philosophical attitude, which became firmament of Christianity. So Bloch was not interested in it, and because of this, he was the first or the only Christian. He was not speaking in terms of professional Christianity. So we do not have to mix these things together, because when we say he was first the only Christian, and if we attribute to Bloch the full knowledge of Christian religion as it was fixed and formulated by those forefathers, and so on, then we are making a huge mistake. He was not aware of it at all in those. And then there is a last thing, which is a moral thing. Actually, when you say, when you check what is known about Jesus Christ as a person, although that part of being which is flesh and blood and suffering and whatever, so we see actually a Jew who lived, who was born as a Jew and died as a Jew, and was called on the Roman how do you call it?
Cross, do you mean?
Cross, yes. Sorry.
Crucifixion. No.
Yes, also the Melech of Jew, that means King of Jews. The connection was that he is Jewish. The whole thing that he was separated from Judaism, it also comes very much later. And for Bloch, Bloch didn't study New Testament, as you know. He didn't study it. His testament was the Old Testament. And you, of course, he then, of course, read the different things about Indians and whatever, and Americans, and whatever, but never the Christianity as a professional cognitive or epistemic entity was far from him right to the end of his life. He remained intellectually and psychologically a Jewish person, like Spinoza, and his outings into outer spheres of Judaism have been typically Jewish. I mean, to find faults with Judaism, it is so right. It is so right. Medinat Israel is how do you call it? Is a great example of fighting faults with Judaism. It is not Jewish in Orthodox way, in Baruch Hashem, that it is not this, because otherwise we would not survive. And it is not it is the greatest achievements of Jews that they went out from this, in my opinion, flawed multi-generational mentality in order to create something which is more solid. And in my opinion, this getting outside the Jewish traditional Jewish epistemic instinct is a true way of Jews.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, thank you. Can I just ask the other question?
Yes.
But thank you for that one. That's very revelatory. I think there are all sorts of interesting things there, which could lead to, of course, a lot of discussion, which would be great.
Yes, of course, many people would say that I am a traitor or whatever. I didn't know that.
No. I hope they wouldn't do that.
They would.
Well, I would like to ask a music question, very quick one. In the Voice in the Wilderness, there are 6 movements. In the Visions and Prophecies, there are 5. I'm wondering whether you have a view as to why Bloch not only, I mean, he obviously reduced the cello and orchestra part, and there's a structure there for piano, but why did he also reduce the number of movements? Do you have a feeling about that?
No, I didn't invest my thought into it, and thank you for bringing it for me. Thank you.
Sure, that's fine. That's fine. I know that it looks to me like that the last movement number 5 of the piano piece is like a conflation of movements 5 and 6 in the orchestral version. And there is a cadenza in there as well for cello. But without going into any complexity about the structure of the work, the Voice in the Wilderness, nevertheless, it would still be interesting to perhaps inquire or investigate why Bloch might have felt the need to reduce the number of movements as well as reduce the medium from orchestra to piano.
Well, first of all, this is another question. Why, in my opinion, the reduction or how do you call it, the compression of orchestral score into piano is not a very promising way of looking at it, in my opinion. I think, wait a minute, I think that Bloch was already aware of extraordinary piano possibilities when it is played not in digital manner, finger digitally, yes, but when it is played by more, how do they play, by string instrument, that means a bit actually extracting sound, but it is a very delicate and inside matter which people do not discuss, especially pianists. There is a possibility to play piano not digitally, but if you play actually with a bow or whatever, there is such a possibility. Yeah. And when he discovered that this possibility exists, and look, he wrote not only this, he immediately wrote also this piano sonata. And then, so it was a discovery of huge importance to him. And then the piano concerto, after all, he also, this concerto symphonic, he also wrote actually in being aware of, maybe to a lesser extent, but of its different special possibilities of sound extraction. And I think the two people brought him to this awareness. First of all, Rachmaninoff, I am not aware whether he visited concerts of Rachmaninoff or not, but I am sure that must be something. They lived in the same time, and they should cross somehow. This at least Bloch, in my opinion, should visit concerts of Rachmaninoff. I do not. You perhaps know it better than
I don't know. No.
but there have been 2 or 3 or 4 pianists who actually played not digitally, but with secret, so-called gliding or whatever, in different bowing versions. Rachmaninoff was one of them. Young Horowitz was another one who copied it, by the way, from Alfred Cortot. Well, secret. And then there have been perhaps Joseph Levin, who also played this way. So how this originated in the piano, piano technique, I do not know. Busoni played this way. I know it because of how he wrote and whatever, and Liszt, of course. So I suppose that he discovered this, and this discovery allowed him to imagine that the piano score could sound fantastic.